Good evening, everyone, and allow me to welcome you to this evening's public lecture on behalf of the India International Center and the Society for Policy Studies. I also want to welcome and convey greetings to all those participants who have joined us online. I can see some numbers of those who are there through the Zoom link. So welcome to all of you also. And this is the first event that we are doing here post-COVID in this in-person format. So it's been particularly, I would say, special for all of us. And I, as someone who's been in Delhi for a while and knows the constraints of traffic, this is a double acknowledgement of your commitment to the energy sector and the global dilemma as far as this is concerned post-Ukraine. So again, I'm so glad you're here. And very briefly, let me sort of give you an overview, both of the subject and of the speaker. First, about this whole series of lectures that we are planning to do in the course of the year. The India International Center, as you're aware, is now celebrating its Diamond Jubilee, 1962 to 2022. And we also have, of course, its coterminous with what the country is doing, 1947 to 2022, 75 years of Azadi. So there are many, I would say, triangulations, and this was an attempt really in the post-COVID context. I'm not sure if we can say post-COVID because the numbers are again edging up, but to the extent that we can meet in this manner, there was a sense that it would be desirable to, in many ways, bring back the rhythm of the public lecture. The IIC over the years, for the last 60 years, and I've known this center for the last 30 years plus, has always been a forum for such interactions. And national security, of course, needs little reiteration in terms of its relevance. And therefore, we embarked on this, and this is the first of a series of lectures. And when we were trying to peg this lecture, as it was, saying that national security itself is such a vast subject, it's complex, it has many layers, what would be most appropriate or relevant now? And clearly, what is happening in Ukraine was the most logical issue on which to deliberate because of, again, many domains that have been affected globally, regionally, and for us in India, because of what is happening in Ukraine. So if you look at the subject itself, we had titled this as Post-Ukraine and the energy sector and the kind of challenges that both India and the world at large would have to deal with. That's the broad background or context both to the subject and why we are doing it as the first subject. And when we were looking at this as I said, an area that needs to be explored, as far as speakers go, those who have spent a lot of time looking at this area, there's nobody more qualified than Shebonti Dadwal. Shebonti has been a colleague of mine at the Institute for Defense Studies many years ago. I retired from there about 15 years ago. But perhaps you came to us from journalism, right? Shebonti, if I remember right, yeah. I mean, her own, I would say, trajectory, and I'm saying this for the students here from the NCS. She was in La Martiniere, Calcutta, right? Then LSR, Lady Shri Ram College. I'm saying this also for the benefit of all our participants on the web. As also Jadavpur, right? So that's a very, I would say, formidable, and maybe not formidable, but let me put it this way, distinctive kind of pedigree, academic pedigree from Calcutta to Delhi back to Jadavpur. And after a brief stint in journalism, she joined us at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. And over there, she focused and specialized both on issues pertaining to West Asia as also the energy sector. And in the last 10 years plus, I would say, she is now acknowledged as a very credible, very leading voice in matters pertaining to both energy and the region. And that's why I was particularly glad that Professor Gulshan Betel is here with us. She's a senior academic who retired from the JNU and she's also with us, and she had taught, would that be right? Or a senior colleague at different points in time. So my reason for requesting Ms. Shebonti to deliver this lecture is that, as I said, if you look at her own contribution, there are two major books that she has authored on energy and the strategic dimension and the relevance for India. And she's also been the lead researcher for a number of projects related to energy. And now, of course, she is retired from the Institute for Defense Studies and is an independent consultant. And over the years, I can't remember, I think this goes back to 10 years plus after I retired. Our conversations start like this. I send her a message saying, Shebonti, can you take a call? And in 2 or 3 minutes, she'll send a message saying, of course. And then I call her. And she knows what is coming, that there'd be a request for some information on numbers or some data or some clarification. And very patiently, she would answer all my questions. And then, of course, I keep telling her that this is like the Arab and the camel, that if she takes a call of mine, there's a little homework that follows. And I think many people who have interacted with me are aware of this. But she's always come up, I would say, trumps with the right information in the most, I would say, lucid and relevant manner. So when we were looking at this subject and for a speaker, my first choice was Shebonti, and she very readily agreed. So I won't take up any more time. This is a complex subject, but as I said, she'll walk us through the post-Ukraine context and what this has done to the energy sector as far as both India and the world are concerned. Shebonti, thank you for taking this on, and please come. Just speak it slide there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, sir, for a very generous introduction. And it's been a while since I've actually really been into the subject, though I do keep up. I have to, because it's really been my area of interest. But not to waste any more time, let's just get on with the thing. Now, I just want to say that I'm not going to be really talking about the Russia-Ukraine crisis per se. I'll be only focusing on the aspects dealing with energy. And I'm going to keep it at a more or less general level. But if we do have time for a Q&A, I can answer any specific questions that you may wish to ask. Now, what struck me most when I was following what was happening over here was that during this crisis was that there have been many, many crises that have taken place, especially between, and always it so happened that energy is, oil especially, is such a subject that any crisis anywhere, there's an almost immediate impact on prices, on oil prices worldwide, because, and this is important to understand, is that oil is a global commodity. It really doesn't matter whether there's a crisis in any one part of the world or any one country. Oil being a global commodity, it has repercussions throughout the oil market. So that is the first thing that I just want to put that right out there right in the beginning. So, but the thing about this current crisis is that there have been many, many upheavals, and always there's been some immediate reaction. But after a while, when there is no danger to supplies, one has seen that prices have stabilized and come down. Now it's almost 2 months now, and this crisis is continuing, and the energy sector continues to be a big area of concern for most countries. So why is it so different this time? Several reasons, of course, can be attributed to this, and Goldman Sachs, in fact, has stated that the world could be now facing one of the largest energy supply shocks ever. Some financial institutions have even said that while the price of oil went over $100 a barrel, if this continues, and if the events continue as, and I'll be speaking about it, the price of oil can even reach up to $180 to $200 per barrel. So it's right now, today, in fact, it was about, Brent is about 107, and WTI, that's the American one, that's about 103, approximately, up and down. It keeps going up and down. So it's about 107 right now per barrel. So as I said, what could be the reason why this particular one? After all, in 2014, if you remember, Russia had also attacked Ukraine and had annexed the Crimea. It never had such a fallout then. There was reaction, of course, for a while, but it petered out and things went back to normal. This time, it seems that things are going to be very, very different. And in fact, someone, I think the other day on television, somebody said it can continue for over a year. Now, one doesn't really know whether that's going to pan out the way it's being said, but one has to be ready for that. What are the reasons for this? Of course, the most important thing is it involves Russia, a major producer, in fact, the third largest oil producer in the world, and it produces about 10.5 million barrels a day. It also is the largest gas producer and exporter. And it in 2021, it produced about 762 billion cubic meters of gas, of which it exported about 210 billion cubic meters of piped gas through pipelines. It controls the entire pipeline, practically, the Russian network of pipelines in Europe. So Russia, even through the Cold War, everything, Russia was the biggest supplier, the main supplier of gas to the EU, and that continues. It is also a major supplier of coal to the world. In fact, it is about it's about 15% of global coal Russia accounts for 15% of global coal, about 10 to 13% of global oil, and 8% of global gas. And also now it was poised to become a major LNG exporter as well. Okay. More than that, it is also a major producer and exporter of food grains and wheat and sunflower oil especially, and metals like palladium, nickel, titanium, aluminum, and copper. Now, all of these have relevance with energy, the food as well as and also because of the fertilizer. It's a major exporter of fertilizers as well, because of the natural gas, which is a major feedstock for fertilizers. There is, of course, we know that the European Union's overwhelming dependence on Russia for its energy supplies, something that has really been troubling the EU for a very, very long time. And over decades, they've been trying to reduce their dependence on Russia, but they've just not gone about it. It's never happened. Now, another reason why it is so worrying and why the oil prices continue, because supplies actually, when you look at it, haven't really stopped. Russia is ready to, and barring 4 countries, that's the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, no other country has imposed sanctions against Russia on the energy sector because of the importance of Russia. Yet you find that the prices are spiking. They're not going to go down below 100. In fact, they're going to be creeping up, they say. It's a possibility. We don't know really exactly what's going to happen. But one of the reasons is because of COVID-19. Already over the last 2 years, because of the pandemic, the economic impact of the pandemic had brought demand down. And as a result, and prices had really plummeted as you remember, if you remember. Now, what happened is that one of the reasons what happens when prices are very, very low, it's great for consumers, but for the energy companies, it's terrible because they need a lot of money. It's a very capital intensive industry. So when when the prices do not match the kind of investments that are required, then they put production on hold, as a result of which they do not produce, and it takes the gestation period for oil to come into the market is approximately 7 to 8 years. So when you have oil wells being capped all over the world because the oil companies didn't find it lucrative to invest in new oil, then you find that the market was already short in supply. So that's another reason why when the sanctions have been imposed, some countries have imposed sanctions, then, and the sanctions, let me come back to the sanctions. The energy sector has not been targeted, just as during the Crimean action also. But the financial system of the Russians have been very, very viciously attacked. And the sanctions have been incrementally becoming wider and broader. So they have been left out of SWIFT, the SWIFT system of messaging. They have not have access to their assets have been frozen in many countries, especially America. And the dollar, you know what the dollar is to the oil industry. So they are not allowed to now have access to SWIFT. So they cannot really, so the economy is suffering and their revenue is suffering. So the Russian production is going down also. It has to go down. So as a result of which all of this is impacting more and more on the supply situation in the market. As a result, prices are not, they're not shooting up as yet, but they're certain because Europe is still buying a lot of Russian gas and oil. They can't do without it. But let me put in a word over here is that right now there were already contracts that had been signed by European Union. Russia is fulfilling them and they are paying Russia for that. Now, within a couple of months, these contracts are going to end. And most of the European countries are saying they're not going to renew these contracts. So all of this is going to be taking a toll on, the oil industry. Messaging is a very, very important factor in the oil sector, in the oil and gas sector. So when you have a message that perhaps in the future, there's not going to be enough demand, then producers are going to be capping it. They're not going to be producing as much. So this is a factor that has impacted. Of course, as soon as 24th of February, the attack began, within a week, sanctions were imposed. And after a couple of, and week after week, the sanctions were strengthened over time. Then you find that Russia has been, it is of course, it is suffering, the financial system, but they are still holding strong. And even though the ruble fell drastically initially, you find that the ruble has now recovered. Its value has recovered. And that is because of Europe continuing to buy Russian, as well as other countries, many other countries like India, China. India had been buying less than 1% of Russian oil. Now, like for instance, I'll give you some figures. In the whole of last fiscal, India had only bought about 15 million barrels or 12 to 15 million barrels of Russian Ural oil. In this 1 month alone, we bought 16 million barrels. So, and we are also going to now, we are looking at buying coal, we're looking at buying gas, we're exploring all of this. We're not going to really, because it's heavily discounted. So we're going to be continuing our trade with Russia. The fact is, with all this going on, I mean, after all, many countries have backed it. You find every day one or the other country saying, we are not going to be buying any more Russian energy. So, but the point is, can Russian oil be replaced in the market? Now, let me now look at the US, which is really the main instigator of these sanctions. Why has the US done this? Earlier, it had not done it against Russia because Russia was important. Now, suddenly in 2014, that is, they hadn't. But 2014, US was not a major oil and gas exporter. Today, it is. Because of the shale revolution that took place in the United States, they have now poised themselves to become major exporter. In fact, the United States today is the largest producer of oil and also gas because of on the back of its shale revolution. So, but US domestic politics also played a hand in this very strong assertive action against Russia. November, the midterm polls are happening. they're going to be taking place in November, the midterm polls in America already. And if you remember Biden, when he came in, it was Trump, of course, who had really pushed for expanding the energy sector in America, pushing for fossil fuels, rather, I would say. Now you find Biden, when he came in on the back of saying, forget fossil fuels, the climate change factor has to wane, and we are now going to be looking at renewable energy. We're going to move away from fossil fuels. Now, this at a time when already the American economy has been floundering over the last couple of because of the pandemic. So at that point of time, of course, demand was low. But now from late 21 onwards, 2021, the American economy has been picking up, as has the rest of the world. Along with it, demand has also been growing. And the renewable energy, because renewable energy is, of course, something that we should all strive for, but it's expensive because the whole global energy infrastructure is really about fossil fuels. Now, to completely change it to renewable energy, it's going to take a lot of investment. And also the volumes, renewable energy cannot give the kind of volumes that fossil fuels can give. For instance, solar. I think all of us know that solar power, of course, it only works in the daytime without storage, that is. Wind, it depends on the weather. So all of these factors, so renewable energy cannot give the volumes that fossil fuels and fossil fuel plants as gas, nuclear, of course, is not gas mainly, which is a power sector, and coal, they can run 24/7. And at the plant load factors are also quite high. Whereas renewable energy, you'll be surprised to know that solar panels actually have a capacity to produce only 19% efficiency levels. There are now innovations and things they're picking up, but most of the solar panels in the world, only between 17 to 19% are of energy they give. So how do you expect the kind of volumes that are required in terms of electricity to come from solar or wind or any other renewable? Hydro, it's climate related, weather related rather. So all of this. So when coming back to the American, when they realized, when demand started picking up, they wanted to go back to fossil fuels. But the problem is they didn't have the price of petrol at that, of diesel and petrol was very, very low, to below 30. Shale oil and American energy independence or supremacy actually took place on the back of shale. And shale, you need a price. The cost of production of shale is only commercially viable if it's $60 a barrel. So you need that price. Now, when the price had fallen to 30, you found a lot of the rig count in America had crashed. And many, many companies had gone out of business. So slowly Biden was forced to be moving back to, to encouraging the production of fossil fuels again. Now, when this happened, when the Ukraine crisis happened, this was a golden opportunity. And Europe is, of course, the most coveted gas market in the world because the prices are the highest, and it's a large market in Europe. So oil, not so much, but definitely for gas. It's a gas-based economy. Europe was a gas-based economy. So when this happened, America looked at it as an opportunity to take over, to really shove out the Russians and take over the European market. That is a factor. That definitely is a factor. It's not just something that is not just a conspiracy theory. But of course, it is geographically not contiguous, so it would have to be LNG. And LNG, because of its nature, is an extremely expensive proposition because you have to have, LNG terminals, the liquid terminals for receiving the LNG, liquefied natural gas, and then you regasify and feed it into the pipelines again for domestic consumption. So it's a very, very expensive, plus the freight from all over the world. So it's expensive. So, and Russia, since Russia was supplying Europe only through pipelines, it was much cheaper. So now they have to counter that. So, but of course, a lot of the four largest economies in Europe, namely Germany, Italy, France, and forgetting the fourth one, Germany, Italy, France. Anyway, they were the largest consumers of energy. They had to be pushed, especially Germany, which had a very strong energy relationship with Russia. They really had to be pushed, but with the new government in place in Germany, they managed to. There must have been deals, promises, which is why Germany backed out of the Nord Stream 2, the second project of Nord Stream, which would have given about 500 BCM of gas to Germany alone. So that was, of course, that was done away. And they have slowly been, and they have now pledged to cut all Russian supplies by the end of this year, 2022, not have. So the promise was that America would fill the gap. And but America alone, of course, cannot, because after all, Russia was supplying a huge amount of gas. So they had also asked their other partners in the Middle East and other countries also, like Australia and all these countries, to fill the rest. They would be supplying them with gas and also with the other countries. Now, this is the problem occurred. OPEC for oil and Qatar for gas. Qatar is no longer an OPEC member now. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out the way America thought it would, because OPEC has a deal with Russia, the OPEC Plus deal. And secondly, UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are the two main producers, and they're the only two countries within OPEC which has spare capacity, where spare capacity means you can very quickly ramp up production. So they said they couldn't, because of the deal that the OPEC had to drive down American shale. In fact, they had flooded the market in 2020 just to drive down the price below $60 so that the Americans wouldn't take over market share. So now, the Saudis, who actually, they are the leaders of OPEC, as one could say that. The Saudis have, the relationship between the US and Saudi has been becoming worse and worse over the last couple of years. One, of course, Mohammed bin Salman, because of the Khashoggi murder case, and Biden hasn't even met him as yet. Secondly, of course, the America has refused to really give weapon sales to the Arabs, because to fight the Houthi rebels in Yemen. There are various factors also, and the Iran factor. Now that America is now looking at back to get Iran back into the international fold, because they need the barrels, Saudis and Iran, I think everybody over here knows the relationship between these two. So they are not happy. So very clearly, UAE and Saudi Arabia has said they are not, they're going to remain neutral, and they are not going to be increasing any production. Also, in Glasgow, in 2021, Glasgow, the climate change meeting that had happened in Glasgow in 2021, November, the IEA had presented a report on climate change, which has said that if the world had to reach the target of reducing carbon emissions by the global warming to 1.5 degrees, then all investments in hydrocarbons has to cease. Now, you can imagine what this means to OPEC countries, who really, their entire lives really depend, their status depends on revenues that accrue from oil and gas. So these are all the factors that the Saudis are very upset with America right now, and they said no, and UAE follows. Qatar. So, but really Europe is about gas. So then what about Qatar? Qatar has said that they might, but it will take them 5 years to actually get the infrastructure in place. If they could, they do not have the volumes to make up. They do not have the volumes alone to make up for lost Russian gas. And one of the reasons could also be that during the 3.5 years that Qatar was ostracized it was Europe which has really ostracized Qatar. It had taken the side of Saudis. So they are not really very happy about, now coming to the rescue of Europe because of Russia. So there are many, many geopolitical and other political factors that are involved. Why there is no. Now, can America alone do it? Technically, yes. They have all the requisite, the wherewithal to actually ramp up production very quickly because of the shale. But the problem is, with Europe having said that they are going to actually move away from fossil fuels in general over the next few years, why would American producers also invest so much money in ramping up production when there will be no buyers? Maybe. One doesn't know. It's a risk which no investor in America is ready to take, to ramp up production to such level that they can practically supply the rest of the world. They're not going to do it. So that is a problem. Anyway, so the other thing, of course, is European infrastructure. Like, as I said before, Europe was receiving all of its gas through pipelines. Now they don't have the LNG terminals and they have to build them now. So how are they going to receive so much of LNG? There is one, of course. Recently we read about Lithuania having, the seaborne, the vessels for LNG, and they have the infrastructure in place to get it. But that's just one country, Lithuania, which has a population of 2.5 million. Imagine the rest of Europe. They will need huge amounts of gas. And where are the terminals to receive that gas? Because it has to come through LNG, with Russia now out of the picture. So how are they going to do that? And besides, it's only for a short while, because they want to go actually to clean energy because of the climate. Europe has been at the forefront of the war against climate change. So these are all the factors. Now let's look at I've laid out exactly what the situation is right now. So what is the future really? One really doesn't know what the future is going to be. It's all speculative. But one thing that is clearly happening is that there seems to be a restructuring of the global energy market into various sectors now. So you have Europe and the West on one side. Now you find America pushing for all the LNG, telling all its partners, Australia, Canada, all the other gas producing countries. Qatar has said no, but a lot of the others, African countries, please send all your gas now to replace Russian gas to Europe. Now, a lot of this gas, please remember that 4 of the largest LNG markets in the world are in Asia: Japan, South Korea, China, and India. India is the 4th, much less than the others, but Japan is the largest. Now, when you have all these all these ships, LNG ships, and they're all on LNG, none of them are piped gas. All the LNG going now to Europe, a lot of it going to Europe, it leaves a shortfall in the Asian market. What does Asia do then? They can do a couple of things. They can turn back to other fuels like coal, like nuclear. So they have to. India, China, Southeast Asian countries are all they're again going back to increasing their coal use. And Japan and South Korea are going back to nuclear in a big way. Something that the Japanese were, after what happened, they were not going to, but now it's a question of their economy. It's sinking because of the high prices of energy. So there's a fragmentation that could be taking place in the global energy market in terms of oil. Now, Russia is also not going to keep quiet. Putin very clearly said recently that they are going to shift their focus from Europe to the south and the east, whatever that means. Obviously, China is a big factor. But so are they also thinking of looking at East Asia, Korea? How long are these countries going to hold out when they are going to get this massively discounted Russian oil and gas? They're all going to give in, just like we have. It is about national interest. And it is about their economy, which has been floundering after 2 years of the pandemic. So it's just a matter of time. Already you find that the high prices have slowly started coming down. Both of gas, which had really shot up the price of gas, has already come down. It was almost $8 per MMBTU. Now it is about 6 point something per MMBTU. So that's a huge amount when you look at it in a huge scale. Oil, which had gone up to $115 or $120 a barrel, has come down to 107, as I said. So it's already coming down. But that, again, there's a caveat there. That is only as far as Russian energy is still going to Europe. That may not be happening for very long. So a fragmentation of the market is possible. Another related one, of course, is Russia was also supplying a lot of, as I said, fertilizers. So now with the stoppage of fertilizers, there could be, in fact, the UN FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, has said that we could be in for a potential massive food crisis, in the global food crisis, because of the fertilizer problem. Many countries in the world have stopped making fertilizers, and they're dependent on a few countries who are making fertilizers, India being one of them. India does have fertilizers, but we're dependent on getting natural gas. It's a feedstock. So with Russian natural gas not being there, or the prices of natural gas shooting up, can you imagine the price of fertilizers? And that is going to impact on food. So coming back to really the main topic, let's look at India per se. What can India do? It's, of course, clearly brought out the vulnerabilities in our energy security framework. We all know that India's energy sector is skewed towards coal in the power sector and oil in the transport sector. But because of its commitments at Paris to bring down our emissions by 35%, 30 to 35% by 2030, India was looking at gas also to become a gas-based economy, doubling our use of our consumption of gas over the next so many years. So all of this has, as a result of which we import about 85% of our oil requirement and about 45 to 50% of our gas requirement. Already it's impacted when you find already the government has massively increased the gas prices in India across the board, CNG, PNG, everything, because domestic gas was selling at a much lower price and than imported LNG. And now LNG is practically, and the government hasn't really allocated it. They're keeping the domestic gas to feed the fertilizer sector, really, and not for the power sector. So coal again comes to the rescue. Now, coal again is in short supply. We are actually maybe facing a massive power shock over the next few days. This is coming out in the papers every day because the coal stocks are so low. We are looking at buying coal again from Russia. So all of this, our dependence on imported fossil fuels and also our own production has not been increased. It's been plateauing for years. And in fact, over the last year, it's come down by 2%, our oil production, domestic oil production, despite a lot of attempts to do that. So India, of course, now, especially the current government, is really pushing for renewable energy to replace imported fossil fuels, oil and gas, etc. Not gas so much, especially oil. Now, can we do that? It is so far the 10% reduction that was expected, the Prime Minister had announced, has not happened. In fact, our imports have been increasing year on year on oil. So let's look at the renewable energy, which is really what we think is going to come to our rescue in terms of this volatility in the fossil fuel markets. Now, I've already explained the problem with renewable energy. The volumes are not there. India's per capita consumption of energy is one of the lowest in the world. But our economy is growing. It's one of the fastest growing in the world. And the standard of living is also going up. Everybody is consuming more and more. So there is really no scope for energy consumption to really come down. It can only go up. Look at the car market, look at the transport sector, look at the individual cars that we have on the road today. It is just, it's not going to come down. It's only going to grow. So can renewable energy, we've done a fabulous job on the renewable energy sector, especially in the solar sector. Massive, from 3%, now we have about 13% coming only from solar. Overall, of course, it's about 32% overall. That is all renewable energy put together. Accounts for all the total energy. But solar is, of course, the main focus now. But is it really going to give us a break from imports? How much we are dependent, just like in the case of oil and gas, we're dependent on imported panels, solar panels, imported wind turbines, imported minerals and metals that make the hardware for renewable energy. So we're looking, and in the transport sector, we're looking at electric vehicles to cut out the use of oil. And electric vehicles there are two factors over here. We need batteries. Batteries means lithium and cobalt mainly. We have nothing. We have no cobalt. We have no lithium in the country. It's all imported. So what are we really looking at? Exchanging one form of import dependency for another. Secondly, also rare earths. Now we have a lot of rare earth. Rare earth is 17 minerals which are used for rare earth, for renewable energy, to make renewable energy. We have it, but you cannot really, the rare earth has to be processed and it has to be turned into magnets before they can be used in renewable energy infrastructure and hardware. We don't have that kind of technological knowledge. So it's all again China. China is the leader in all of this. So we are going to be, right now we're trying to move away from dependence on oil from the Middle East, especially because of all the turbulence over there. We are going to get dependent for renewable energy on China of all countries. So that is what we're looking at. Now, this is a very bleak scenario that I'm painting. There are, of course, a lot of things that we can do, and I'm quickly going to wrap up, sir. Let's first look at the fossil fuel sector. What can we do now? Of course, ramp up production. We've done all the NELP and the HELP and all of these policies that have been put in place to ramp up production. It hasn't worked. Of course, the pandemic is a lot to blame also because of that. But it's as I said, capital intensive sector, and a lot of money is required, a lot of investment is required, which the oil companies were not ready to do because they're already suffering because of, again, domestic politics, not allowed to increase the price of oil, et cetera, et cetera. We won't really go into that. The fact is that production has in fact come down. So coal production has come down because of all the reforms that have been taking place. In any case, our coal was of such poor quality with high ash content that we had to import a lot of coal, increasingly import coal. So what can we do then? Okay, so we have SPR, Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Now currently the SPR has only 9.5 days. So which can really take place because the rationale was that any kind of supply disruption shouldn't last more than a week. But we only have 9.5 days. Of course, on top of that, we have commercial stocks by the companies, oil companies keep it, and the defense have their own stocks. So altogether, but it still doesn't come to the 90 days that is mandated by the IEA for having strategic stocks. We are, of course, building more. We have 3 right now. We are building another 2. And we are hoping, but it's going to come at a cost of $4.5 to $6 billion. That's the kind of cost that's required for building strategic reserves. Again, capital intensive. We can do that, of course. Then we have to redo the grid. As I said, the infrastructure right now, the energy infrastructure is skewed towards fossil fuels. To get to smart meters, the grid has to be updated. You have all these things. So that, again, we can do that. We should be doing that. That, again, is an expenditure. What else can one do? We can, of course, India was one of the first countries in the world to, in fact, look at renewable energy not from a climate change perspective in the 70s, but from a energy security perspective. It's changed a lot to climate because of the climate factor. But, and we are the only country in the world, I think, which has a dedicated ministry on renewable energy. But yet, nothing really has been happening till now. So what we really need to do now is, if we really are, in Glasgow, the PM said now we have reworked our target for renewable energy to 500 gigawatts. That is about 500,000 megawatts of renewable energy from all kinds of sources, hydro and solar and everything else, of course. We haven't even reached the 175 by 2022 that we have, and we're going to fall short. But this is the target that we are making now, 5 by 2030. So this is but what do we need then to do that? It's doable, but the problem is lack of R&D. India has one of the worst, the least, not worse, the least amount of money that is spent on energy or clean energy R&D. When you compare it with other countries like Japan and China, America, it's far less. So also, we have our partnerships with various countries on clean energy partnerships with lots of countries, but it's a government control thing. What we need is for the private sector to get involved. The private sector is practically, and the government doesn't share its technological knowledge. Neither has it been investing in developing the human resources for dealing with it. Now you get a technology from abroad. It has to suit Indian conditions, so it has to be tweaked. But we need that kind of R&D we get the technology and then make it ours. All of this needs a lot of investment in R&D, and that's not happening. And also, it doesn't share knowledge or technical knowledge. So every company which is really getting technology from abroad has to go it alone. So that's an added expense and unnecessary one. So there are a lot of, and I'm running out of time now, so I'm going to end over here. There are a lot of factors that can be taken on board to deal with the situation. After all, look at Europe, it is such a fossil fuel oriented bloc, but now they are very confident of really going completely, clean energy, specifically and they can do it, and they're quite sure they're going to do it. Look at China, how much they have progressed in clean energy. What we need to look at our own manufacturing. Solar modules, only 9% is manufactured in India. The rest is all imported. Why do we need this? We have the wherewithal, we have the technical expertise. What we lack is the kind of investment that is required to ramp up this kind of technological knowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Shebonti. I think that's a vast kind of canvas you covered and the policy options that you mentioned. So if it's okay by you, I'll take a few questions from here and the rest from the chat box. Okay. I think you need a tall drink, but have water first and then we'll get to the tall drink. I'll recognize people for questions first here, and then those who are participating through the web link cyber, please send your questions to the chat box and they'll come up here. So Ashwini, I'll go with you first and then I'll, please, Colonel Chanan, just give him the mic, please, because we are recording, so you need to speak in the mic. Just introduce yourself so that the recording is done.
Ashwini Chanan, a veteran from the Army, and I worked there after my premature retirement. I worked with an American company called Honeywell. And Honeywell has a company called UOP, which makes the catalyst that provides to approximately 70% of the global refinery catalyst. So I was aware of the question that on the comment that you made on the American companies investing in the oil sector. And yes, that's a very relevant point you made about the shale industry, that it needs a $60 price level for it to be sustainable. But the question that we used to often ask, and this was including our interaction with the government here, was what is the future of refineries if at a certain point of time the demand for fossil fuels is going to come down And if I remember correctly, the figure was 2030 or 2035 for the global demand of fossil fuels to peak out and then to gradually start coming down. And for India, I think it was 2050. Given that we have these milestones, which are perhaps 2 years back before the pandemic, do you see that with these milestones, such energy issues, strategic issues, which are heavily dependent on natural resources like fossil oils, gas, and coal, would it continue to give us shocks as we are open about this evening? Thank you.
You want to answer there itself? Okay. The only thing is that if you answer from here, then your fan club in Calcutta, would perhaps be able to hear you. So why don't you speak from here and you can just paraphrase the question so that.
Okay. If I understood you correctly, you want to know what is the future of refineries, given that fossil fuels demand is going down. Is it really going to go down? Now you have global demand for energy, electricity. We're looking at electrification of everything, including our own railways, for instance. We are planning that by 2030, we're going to completely electrify our railways. We are going in for EVs, which have to be we have to be plugged in every night or whatever. All of this is on electricity. Now, where is that electricity going to come from? Renewable energy, we're looking at green hydrogen. We're looking at a lot of renewable energy. But as I said, the kind of volumes that are required to ramp up the electrification process that the world is going over, where is that electricity going to come from? Only from renewable energy? No, obviously not. So fossil fuels is going to survive for the foreseeable future. It will come down, certainly, because a certain amount will be replaced by cleaner fuels. But overall, I will say that let's not write off fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, whatever, because of the sheer volumes that they can provide for electricity. So if electricity can be called clean energy, fine. Now, refineries, most of the Western world, the developed countries, have actually done away with refineries because of environmental issues. It is only Russia was a huge producer of refined oils, petroleum, diesel, etc., petrol, diesel. India has lots of refineries. You find that the Arab countries are now looking at building. Now that they have their pulse. They have the pulse on the thing. By the way, just one nugget of information is that recently Saudi Arabia and the UAE has said that they are no longer going to look at IEA data. Now, the data that you're talking about, that fossil fuels is going to be over the next couple of years, it's been rejected by the OPEC countries. They say we have our own data now, we are going to make our own data. We do not believe the IEA because it's Western agenda oriented. So we really don't know what the future is going to hold. We can only look, but given the kind of demand that is going up for overall energy and electrification also, fossil fuels are here to stay for the foreseeable future.
Just stay there so that,
Yeah.
Give him the mic, please. You can just mention the question in summary and then answer for the way.
Okay.
My name is G.D. Bagari. You see, I'm wearing a mask, not just for COVID, but because Delhi is the most polluted capital in the world. Now you're saying that fossil fuels are heavily in demand and renewable energy is going to take a long time in India. So do you think pollution is ever going to come down in India in the next 20, 30 years?
I hope it will. Pollution, I hope, is going to come down over the next, 20, 30 years, hopefully in the next couple of years, I hope. But the fact is that how much of it is really because of just fossil, yes, the relationship between fossil fuels and emissions, carbon emissions, has been well established. And it is a fact that we cannot ignore anymore. But when you look at the pollution, in fact, in Delhi, if you're talking, it's not just because of the cars. It's also because of burning of crops. It's because of the dust. It is weather related, a lot of the factors. And also one of the things that I should have mentioned is that we need to make people much more aware about the costs of energy. I think there's very little knowledge about what energy security is really all about. it's not just a security related thing. It's energy affects our everyday lives. So if we don't use it judiciously and in a more conscious way, I think everybody's going to suffer, and we are all suffering. Now tell me, a lot of countries in the world, the developed countries especially, have been using fossil fuels for years, which is one of our, what we are saying, that why should we give up coal? Why should we give up this? Why should we give up that? When they have actually thrived on the back of fossil fuels. Their countries and their cities are not as polluted, but they've been using a lot of fossil fuels. So it's not just fossil fuels. It does contribute, but not, you can't say that it's only because of that.
Sorry? Thank you. I'm General Bhattacharya. Your presentation was really multidimensional and very lucid. My question is, there are countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, which have got very large assets, untapped assets in the Caspian Sea. Will they now come into play, and will that matter? And how will they ramp up production, and where do they stand?
The Caspian has been, of course, the Caspian Sea has been an area of a lot of turbulence, because it's been established that it has, the resources are there, very much there. But how to access them was one problem, and the dispute about who gets what share. Okay. Now it is the Caspian Sea doesn't have any outlets. So pipelines have to be built from the Caspian Sea to take it to the markets. Iran and Russia were on one side, and the other three countries which were bordering the Caspian Sea was on the other side. There was a dispute about who should have access to it: Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. So these countries, the problem with all the Central Asian countries is lack of access. They're all land-bound countries. Geographically, they need export outlets. And they have either to go through China or through Russia or through Iran. These are the three. So all of them, they're competitors in a sense, I would say. So which is why till date, all the Central Asian countries were bound to export all their energy through Russia. So they were looking at China as an alternative. But they had to be dependent. So they are really, it's a very sad situation that they have. They have all the resources, but they cannot access the markets because of geography. So they have to make deals, and they're hugely exploited by both China as well as Russia in terms of the pricing situation. So even though I think some kind of new arrangement has happened between Russia and Kazakhstan has really recently made some kind of deal, but how are they going to export it? It's the same story. China has made it very clear, because they want to, for their energy security, they want to capture all the Central Asian energy for themselves. But that is not in their interest to do so, because then they'll become a captive again to the politics of China. And the Russians have exploited them for decades. So really, what's the point?
Sir? Yeah. Thank you, madam. My name is Naresh Sagar. I run a media company. So we all go through all these problems, and we have seen that things are worsening. But still, there is a silver lining. As I know, you have not mentioned Brunei and a lot of African countries, Nigeria, many countries which are producing. And wherever we get, supply cheaper, India is there to buy, and they have various resources to buy. There is nothing wrong about it. My question is now, when we know the technology is very important, and all the countries like South Korea and other smaller countries like Taiwan, Singapore, where our sons or daughters go to study in Singapore or in Australia, where education is labeled as one of the best in the world. And France, is still, UK is still one of the best education system. Why can't
to get rid of all these problems, why can't we have, I know there is no, government representative here, why we don't ask for better education, why we send, 2 million people go to study abroad. So unless and until we have best education, we can't have the best technology. Thank you.
Please do that, but just before,
please.
about the latter half, the first half, you said I didn't mention Africa. I'm sorry I didn't. But part of the solutions we have for our fossil fuels is diversification of energy sources. And Africa and Latin America is where we are going. In fact, we've increased it, all those other countries, about more than 14 to 23% of our oil now comes from African countries, and about 10% from Latin American countries, 10 to 13% from Latin America. Iran, no, Iraq. Iraq is our largest, not Iran. Iran, we are not buying because of the problem.
Mr. Sagar, you have raised actually a very important issue about education in its larger sort of context as far as India is concerned. I will sort of refer to that towards the end because I had made a note of that. But I have a couple of questions that have come on WhatsApp, and I think there are some in the chat box. So what I'll do is, may I come back to you, sir, when I finish with this, so that people who are in the chat box and who are outside are sort of told that they're on board and we are taking their questions. I've got one on WhatsApp. Shebonti, you might want to answer that. Mr. Vikram from Pune, I think. He's asking about the Ukraine war and the impact on China. If you would like to sort of spend a few minutes on that, and then I'll take one question on the chat, and then I'll come back to the floor. So let me pull up the chat. So why don't you answer the question on China? How the Ukraine war has impacted geopolitics of Eurasia?
Well, China, I think, as everybody knows, has refused to abandon Russia. And in fact, their relationship has been growing stronger over the last couple of years. Russia has built a massive pipeline that is going to be carrying Russian gas to China. The Friendship pipeline, something like that is called. Also though currently I would say Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. Secondly, at the moment, in terms of energy alone, when you look at it, Chinese, because of the pandemic, the huge rise in COVID cases in China, their economy has been shut down. Shanghai, which is really their commercial capital, has been shut down. And their economy and the demand for energy, in fact, has also come down. In fact, that's one of the reasons also why prices of oil and gas have been coming down, because the China factor, China's demand has come down. So that has contributed to the fall in prices somewhat. But even then, despite that, China is a huge, everybody, including India, realizes that more than Russia today, for the Americans especially, China is really the problem. They are worried. One of the reasons why this attack also, and this is not from an energy perspective, one of the reasons why the attack on Russia, the response to Russia was so strong was because if it wasn't strong, that the same thing could happen in Taiwan. And that is something that the Americans want to send out a message that they're not going to be holding back. They're going to come in to any fight. So that's one of the thing. But coming back to the Ukraine, China hasn't been affected. China has come under a lot of American criticism for sitting on the fence, as it were. Janet Yellen, her latest speech on the 13th of this month in Atlanta, where she said those countries, and she was targeting China, but it also could include India, when she said those countries sitting on the fence and keeping relations with Russia, they are not in fact hurting the sanctions regime. We are not indifferent to them, and repercussions will happen. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but she warned these countries, India and especially China, that there would be repercussions in future. So, but China is not listening, and China is not going to abandon Russia. But strangely enough, China has reduced its oil and gas purchases from Russia. That could be because of their own economy has now done, but also probably they are sitting on the fence.
Yes, sir. Just introduce yourself.
My name is Rahul Chandani. I'm a journalist with the print. So a little while ago, you mentioned that India was one of the first countries in the world to look at renewables from an energy security perspective rather than climate change or an environmental one. So I was wondering if you could like elaborate a little more on that and where that led to back at that time when India explored that possibility. And the other thing I was thinking about was that if you could elaborate a bit more on how India can redo the grid and how that would impact our energy.
Sorry, the second part, India?
How India can redo the grid and how that would
Redo the
impact
grid.
energy security. If you could elaborate a bit more on that as well. Thanks.
Okay. About the ministry, initially in the 70s, right after the oil shock, and especially in the early 90s, you know that we had to go through a balance of payments problem, and we had enough funds only for buying 2 weeks of oil. So all of this really put energy security on the top of the government's agenda, government of that time agenda. So they decided that they had to move to alternatives to fossil fuels, and renewable energy was there. So first it was just a department. It wasn't a full-scale ministry. And then slowly over time, they actually became a full-fledged ministry. But for many years, this ministry was really not, I would say, as active as it could have been. It's only from 2013 onwards that there's been a renewed kind of vigor and a lot of funds and a lot of, attention is being paid to the renewable energy, MNRE as it's called, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. So that's really in a nutshell the background of that. We are still the only country in the world, I think, with a renewable energy, dedicated renewable energy ministry. Regarding the grid, our grid is old. The T&D losses, transport and distribution losses are massive. The breakdowns are regular. Now, for all of this, they need to be upgraded. And also now if renewable energy, which is now mandatory for many states to feed in green energy into the grid along with coal and gas, to ensure that there is, you remember in 2012 what happened? There was a massive blackout all over North India. There was 600 million people in India were affected because of that. That was because there was a surge. There was a kind of a mismatch between demand and supply. There was too much of energy had come into the grid. Now, the thing is with renewable energy, like solar energy right now without storage, that is, it comes in at certain, but during peak power they used, peak demand they used, and it's ramped down again. It is only the fossil fuel plants that run on 24/7 basis, plant factor. Now, you have to actually calibrate depending on how much power demand is required to feed that kind of electricity into the grid. But this all requires smart grids. So we need smart grids which can computerize the computerization of the grid, and the modernization of the grid is very, very important to kind of calibrate that kind of demand and supply regulation. So that's what I mean by saying, and of course, the infrastructure, when we have the 24/7 policy of providing 24/7 electricity for all. So you need massive expansion of the grid. And they're now saying that earlier there were 5 grids in India, now they're trying to make it into 1 grid. So all of this will require a lot of modernization and a lot of upgradation.
There's one more question, just stand here. This is from the chat box. I took
Yes.
it on the WhatsApp. I'm reading out this question of Mr. B.M. Khanna, which has come into the chat box. The question is, why such high levies on petrol and diesel? Is there a way out?
Well, recently when the price of petrol had gone up, the government had reduced the excise duty. But let's not fool ourselves. First of all, this taxation structure on petrol, diesel, on products, petroleum products, is extremely non-transparent. So, and you have several taxes, and it is a main source of revenue for governments, state governments, as well as the central government. So you have excise, which is the central government, and then you have the VAT, which is imposed by the state. And there's a lot of resistance to bring it under GST, because then it becomes uniform. And, so, and all these, the transparency then becomes much more clear if it's under GST. They don't want that to happen. Also, there's been years, a couple of months when the price of oil was really low. The oil companies are the biggest cash cows of the government. They pay them a lot of revenues, and in fact, the coffers of the government are filled a lot by them. So if you are going to be looking at, we are supposed to have the administered pricing mechanism is supposed to have been done away with, but it's just, they're still administered, which is why, despite the rise in price of oil over so many months, the UP elections ensured that the prices were not increased. So what freedom of pricing is there? So pricing mechanism is also, a realistic pricing mechanism is also an extremely important factor for our energy security. And unfortunately, the politics come in the way for that.
Anybody here that wants to make a, Professor Datel, if you would like to, ma'am, any of our other energy and geopolitical experts, Raji, you want to make a comment? Okay, there's one more question coming in, and I'll read this out if I may. You can then make notes on this. Russia has never used the energy security card to threaten Europe. European reaction to wean away from Russian oil and gas has been unilateral. They are exacerbating the crisis. Do you think Europe has got the wherewithal to completely insulate itself from Russian fossil fuels in the next couple of years? Or is it just an emotional outburst and it will be business as usual after the war? This is from Vineet Sagar. We'll make this the last question, if you can respond from here. For Vineet Sagar, you're getting your answer just now, sir.
Well, I thank you for that question. First of all, Russia has never exploited its position as an energy supplier to Europe, maybe not to Western Europe, but certainly to Eastern Europe time and again, to Georgia, Ukraine in the past, Belarus, which is now an ally of Russia. And of course, it has used its position as the only network provider, or pipeline network provider, to decrease the kind of payments that have to be made to the sources of supply. So, and these are all part of, maybe that's true, the Central Asian states, but also for whenever transit fees have been, the countries like Georgia and Belarus and Ukraine have tried to increase transport fees, Russia has always, on some excuse or other, has intervened, and there's been a little bit of a conflict over there. And also, it's not true that Russia hasn't exploited. Yes, it hasn't exploited Western Europe because it's such a lucrative market. And they didn't want to lose it. The source of revenue, $35 billion a year, comes only from Western Europe for Russia. Why would they want to jeopardize that? So that is one reason why, I think. But coming to the second part of the question is, can Europe actually exit from Russian supplies? The answer is what, in fact, Janet Yellen said yesterday. And Yellen has begged the European countries to stop, to completely move away from Russian gas because of the impact it's going to have on the world economy in terms of high prices. So if Yellen, the Treasury Secretary of the US, she has said, she's begged the European countries not to completely stop buying Russian energy. And I think there might be, a lot of it is rhetoric, of course. And of course, as I said right in the beginning, that Europe has really been trying very hard to lessen or completely cut its dependence on Russia. And now they're looking at it on the back of American promises, pledges. They're trying to do just that. But as realistically speaking, it's not going to be happening. It's not, I don't think that, unless they can ramp up, and can they ramp up renewable energy to such a large extent? Or are they going to look at huge price rises for imported LNG from other parts of the world? It's a choice that they have to make.
It's a country which depends on hydro projects. Norway, Finland. These are the-
Norway has its own oil also.
They have all of
Mr. Sagar, I hope that was an adequate response, and I'm afraid I can't take any more because we have to close this session at 8 p.m. and that's what we had told all our participants, so you will forgive me. But please send your questions, those of you who are still on the Zoom link and who are hearing this program and listening to the proceedings. We'll try and send them onwards to Shebonti and request her to send a response. I'm presuming I haven't missed out anybody who's sitting here in person in the audience. I just want to make a couple of broad points, and I'll pick up from what Mr. Sagar had drawn our attention to, which is this whole question of the focus on education and its own relevance when we look at energy. And at the outset, I'd like to compliment and thank Ms. Shebonti Dadwal for giving us what I would call as this very lucid overview of a very complex subject, which she had linked with, of course, the war in Ukraine and impact on India. But since we have some students here from the Naval School and we have other younger researchers and people who have tuned in on the Zoom link, I'm taking the liberty of making a broader observation, which is that when you think of energy, the concept of energy itself is at one level cosmic, meaning that if we were to look at this in terms of really the largest possible context of the solar system, we look at the sun as the source of all energy, and it has many connotations, philosophical and theological and various other dimensions. But we are talking about energy which has also mediated the history of mankind, not only the history of the solar system, if you want to get into that dimension, but let us not go there because this is the end of a lecture on energy security for India related to the Ukraine war. I think you can see the correlation between energy and our understanding of energy, going back to education, sir, our comprehension, and its impact on the larger trajectory of the evolution of mankind, literally. I mean, it would be fair to say that man's discovery of fire allowed the ability to regulate light, illuminate, as also heat. And from there, there are various ways of understanding the impact of the comprehension of energy and its utilization and its harnessing. But as I said, that's a very vast subject and it's beyond my pay grade. I'll stick to geopolitics. And that is where our trigger for today's discussion was the Ukraine war and what it has done. One broad observation, and again, I'm saying this looking at these children from the NCS, and you might want to sort of do some homework on this, that it's possible to look at recent modern history, recent as in the last 300-400 years, and link geopolitics with the technology of energy. Meaning, very broadly, I'm reducing this to a thumbnail, literally a Twitter, that you can look at the evolution of energy from solid, which is coal, in relation to hydrocarbons, and progressively, maybe 100 years as a ballpark figure, it moves from solid to liquid. Again, technology enables the movement of harnessing, utilizing energy from liquid to gas. And very broadly, again, I'm simplifying some large layers of history, but colonial history can be mediated, the European powers, Britain in particular, how they were able to capture through the Industrial Revolution and more. You see the correlation between energy, technology, and military capability, and the whole geopolitics. Both, I'm a sailor, so I'm taking the liberty of talking about trade and flag. That connectivity through the oceans of the world enables you to trade, and to protect your trade, you bring your guns. And we in India are familiar with that story of going through the whole experience of colonization, and we are not alone. So I think this is one whole way of looking at energy and geopolitics. And what the war in Ukraine has done, and this is where I'm extrapolating from what Ms. Shebonti has explained to us this evening, is that there is a massive disruption now because of the war in Ukraine, Russia's own locus as a major supplier, particularly for Europe, and what this conversion will do. And for us, and I think particularly for generation next, we've been having some cyber chats over the last few days in preparation for this lecture. You can see, and I think Shebonti had brought this out, the linkage between energy and the environment. So we're talking about climate change. And I think she's made a very important observation that Europe has with great resolve moved away from its dependence on fossil fuels. It's also shed the nuclear component, by the way, because of the same environmental factors, and taken some very difficult decisions. And here again, I think we have to acknowledge both the political leadership in these countries as also the base of technology and education that allowed them to make these choices and go down certain paths. So you have energy, you have environment. And this, I think, is the linkage that we in India would also have to understand, which means that the next generation, which is going to inherit, frankly, a rather messy world in more ways than one, would also have to grapple with energy options. And that is where I think education becomes the bedrock. And to look at the right kind of harmonization, since we are speaking about energy and environment, we have to literally go beyond the planet, because we are in a situation today where climate change is going to perhaps affect the oceans of the world first. And that in turn will have impact. And at the end of the day, any aspect of security, we're talking about energy security today in relation to India, would have to have a correlation with human security. I mean, that is the ultimate, shall we say, responsibility of those who are governing. And I'm reminded of some of the lines that we have in the Arthashastra. And we often remember and talk about Chanakya and Kautilya, about this mandala and the neighbor's neighbor. But I think there are many layers of understanding Chanakya and Kautilya. And one of them is his focus when he talks about the responsibilities that devolve on the rulers. In today's context, we talk about our elected representatives, is the dharma of governance is to ensure what in his writings he has referred to as the Yogakshema. I'm sure most of you in this audience and those who are on Cyber and Zoom are aware that Yogakshema is really a reference to well-being, the well-being of the individual. And that in turn has to relate from the micro to the macro. And we can extend the spectrum. And when we talk about the well-being, it's not only of the human being, but the well-being of life, because the human being cannot be well if you pollute the rest of the matrix of life that we are so dependent on. And you can build on this in different ways. So you can see this, what I would call as this non-linear linkage between energy as a concept as we understand it, and the whole systole and diastole, the very rhythm of life, not necessarily confined to the human condition. And I think these are some of the, I would say, reverberations when we reflect on the larger issue. I want to thank Ms. Shebonti Dadwal again for giving us this opportunity to meet in this manner and deliberate on some of these important issues. I want to thank the in-person audience at the India International Center this evening. You have braved the traffic. Those of you who came from Safdarjung Tomb along that road would know what I'm talking about, but thank you for being here. I also want to thank those who have joined us through the Zoom link and through the other platforms, the integration with YouTube and so on. And as I said, if you have any questions, please send them on the chat box or on email. And for our younger members here, if you are inclined to write about this and let us know why you don't agree with Ms. Shebonti Dadwal and that her understanding of the subject is perhaps not the way you see it, please let us know. We'll publish you on our website. And in conclusion, I want to thank the India International Center. We're doing this, as I said, after COVID, and it's taken lots of effort from many people whom we cannot see for putting this together, but IIC and its various representatives, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the SPS. I can see our lone Trojan sitting here, Sushil, and all the others who have helped us. And this small subgroup that we have that looks after this particular activity that we've just started. There is Saresh Bhattacharya, Ashwini, Aditi, I don't know, she's here. Oh, sorry, Aditi is not here, she couldn't come, but Global Youth India has been able to help us to put the cyber and the social media awareness together. So if I missed out anyone, my apologies, but thank you so much. And we'll do this again. And if your emails are not already with us, please give them to Sushil and we'll make sure that you get the invitations for sometime in mid-May. On that note, thank you very much and good night. And Shebonti, thank you again.